Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned for the Robert E. Howard Show, where we gaze into the future to September and the return of Cimmerian September, the fantastic reading event where we celebrate Conan, Robert E. Howard's greatest creation, Conan. Now, last year was the very first Cimmerian September, and it was magnificent. So last year, we read the original Conan stories by Robert E. Howard. We read them all, which you can get in this 3-volume set from Del Rey. And in my opinion, at the moment, this is the greatest way to read these stories. There are a couple other ways, but this Del Rey set is beyond compare. It has fantastic artwork. It has every scrap that Robert E. Howard wrote about Conan. So this is the real stuff right here. And we read the original Conan stories for Cimmerian September, and it was wonderful. This year, it's going to be a little bit different. You can, if you haven't read these though, if you've never read the original Conan stories, then I encourage you this Cimmerian September to read the original Conan stories by Robert E. Howard. These are wonderful. This is the real stuff. This is the real Conan. But much like that other fictional character, Sherlock Holmes, there's been a lot of pastiche fiction written about Conan, just as there has been about Sherlock Holmes. A lot of Sherlock Holmes pastiche fiction out there. And much like Sherlock Holmes, there's actually more pastiche fiction out there than there is the original, in the original canon. And this year for Cimmerian September, we're going to be looking at that. Like I said, if you haven't read the originals, read those. But I'm opening it up this year, Roger and I. We're opening it up to anything Conan this September. So if you want to take part, all you have to do is read anything Conan. Anything your little barbarian heart desires, you can read. Because there's been a lot of pastiche fiction out there, starting with the L. Sprague de Camp Lynn Carter series of books, which I'm going to get into in a second. But there was also a very long series of books from Tor. And now, actually, there's some new Conan pastiche fiction out there that's available from Titan Books. And I think they're going to publish more of that stuff. And, of course, there are the comic books. Anything is fair game this year for Cimmerian September. And the comic books are a pretty big part of Conan's history. They were one of the things that made Conan so popular, is the success of the Conan comic book from Marvel Comics back in the 70s and the 80s. I have all of those comics, and I think this year I'm actually going to be diving into some of those. For sure I will be. I have a lot of those old Marvel comics in omnibus form. A lot. Fortunately, I did get every single Conan omnibus volume from Marvel as they were coming out. And Conan the Barbarian, the color comic book series, lasted, well, it was published in 10 omnibus volumes. So every single issue of Conan the Barbarian was published by Marvel in the omnibus volumes, and I have them all. As far as Savage Sword of Conan, though, they did not finish reprinting the series before they lost the rights to Conan. So that only goes up to volume 8 in the omnibuses. And I do have all of those, though. And I have the King Conan omnibus, which doesn't have the whole series. And I have the Kull omnibuses, all 3 of them that have everything Kull. And I have Solomon Kane. So there's a lot of comics I could read. So I will be reading some of those. But the main thing I'm going to be reading this year for Cimmerian September, and like I said, you could read anything Conan, but the main thing I'm going to be reading this year is this. This is the original set of books edited by L. Sprague de Camp of Conan. And this set of books actually is probably the main thing that made Conan popular back in the late 60s and the 70s, and then there was the comic book. I've always had a grudge against this set of books. Always. And a lot of Robert E. Howard fans have, because in this set of books, what L. Sprague de Camp does, he takes the Conan stories, he sorts them in chronological order, which is not how Robert E. Howard wrote the stories. Robert E. Howard wrote the stories, and the stories jumped around in Conan's career. The very first Conan story was a story where Conan was already king of Aquilonia towards the end of his career. Then he went back with Tower of the Elephant shortly after that to the very beginning of Conan's career. So he jumped around. But L. Sprague de Camp decided to make a chronological saga out of it, which, okay, you could do that. But what he did, which is blasphemous, it's absolutely blasphemous, Roger. Roger agrees. If L. Sprague de Camp was still around, he'd cast a spell on him for this. But probably, you didn't turn him into a toad, did you? He probably would, though. Anyway, what L. Sprague de Camp did to expand the series and, make himself some change, L. Sprague de Camp added to the series in a couple ways. He wrote some original stories. He had Lynn Carter write some original stories. And they mixed those stories in with Robert E. Howard's original stories in this set of books. He also took some non-Conan stories that Robert E. Howard wrote about other characters in other time periods, and he changed those. He, let us say, heavily edited those and turned them into Conan stories, and then added them to this set of books. And I strongly disapprove of that sort of thing. I think it's disrespectful, for one, to the author to change an author's work after the author has already passed away. It's one thing if the author is still alive, but it's different if the author is dead and can have no input on what you're doing with his work. So I don't like that, for one thing. Also, we were talking about Sherlock Holmes. There's the original canon of Sherlock Holmes books, and I have nothing against pastiche fiction at all. But I don't believe you should mix up pastiche fiction in with the original stories of an author. That can cause confusion, among other things. And nobody would think of doing that. As far as I'm aware, nobody's done this. With Sherlock Holmes, there's the original canon of Sherlock Holmes books written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle that stand alone as the official canon. And then if you want to write pastiche fiction, you can. And there's all this other pastiche fiction about Sherlock Holmes. All of this can exist. But, don't mix it in with the original Sherlock Holmes stories. That stands apart as the original canon. But that's what they did with Conan the Barbarian. And for years, and this is the other problem with this, for years, that was the only way you could read Conan. That was literally the only set available for years and years and years. So if you were a fan of Robert E. Howard, the only way you could get the Conan stories were in a set of books that had other people's stories mixed in. Other people's stories which weren't nearly as good as Robert E. Howard's stories. And I think this is one of the things that made any kind of critical appraisal of the Conan stories very difficult. Because if you were a casual reader picking up the Conan stories, you saw that these books were written by different authors. Okay, did Robert E. Howard write all of this? No, look, there's other authors in here, but who did what? And when did they do it? It'd be hard as a casual reader to work it out. And why should you? Really, you're just wanting to read some books, but some of the stories don't feel like some of the other stories, and there's a reason for that. And so I've always had a grudge against this set of books, always. Now it's very different, because now in today's world, it is pretty easy to get the original Conan stories, and this is the way they're available now. This set of books is out of print and has been out of print for quite some time. This is the way you get Conan now, the real thing. And then you can get pastiche fiction if you like and read it for Cimmerian September. But I am going back to this set of books because it was pointed out to me last year at Cimmerian September when I was griping about this very subject. Someone said, well, how can you really do an appraisal of this, because you've said yourself that you haven't read these for years? I literally haven't read these probably since the 1980s, which was a little while ago. It was a while ago. It was some time ago. So there are stories in this, that the non Robert E. Howard stories, that I haven't read, and I'm always saying how terrible they are. So I should probably actually read them as, an elderly person and give my appraisal. So I'm going back to this set of books because I do have to give it credit for one thing, and that this is the way most people came to Conan, the original Conan stories anyway. This is what made Conan popular, this in Marvel Comics. And so I have to give it credit for that. And a lot of people have an affection for the series for that very reason. I think that they should have come out with a set of Robert E. Howard's original stories first, and then put out pastiche books if you wanted to. I think Conan would be just as popular. You still could have had magnificent Frank Frazetta covers, and this is a magnificent Frank Frazetta cover. We don't want to not give Frank Frazetta credit, because some of his covers for these Conan books are just, actually all the covers he did are just magnificent. And they certainly helped sell Conan, that's for sure. So I'll be reading this set of books, which starts with Conan. It's just titled Conan. And this does have stories by DeCamp and Carter. This has The Tower of the Elephant, The God in the Bowl, and Rogues in the House. And those are the only original Robert E. Howard stories in here. But you also have other stuff. You have The Thing in the Crypt, which is written by Lynn Carter and L. Sprague DeCamp. You have The Hall of the Dead, which was an outline by Howard that was finished by L. Sprague DeCamp. It's pretty much all L. Sprague DeCamp, really, except for the plot, from what I remember. We have The Hand of Nergal, or Nergal, by Robert E. Howard and Carter. I believe that is one of the examples of where you have a Howard story. Or was this from an outline? This one might have been from an original outline. So that's probably mostly Lynn Carter. But The City of Skulls by Carter and DeCamp was original. And I think later on in the series, you're going to get some of those original Howard stories that were just historical adventures or other things like that, and they were turned into Conan. I really don't like that sort of thing when that happens. But, I'm going to read it and give my opinion of them as I read them. So this is the first one. Great cover, man. That is a great cover from the story Rogues in the House. The second book is Conan of Cimmeria, another magnificent cover. I have these all in different editions. But this is the second book in the series, Conan of Cimmeria. This is from The Frost Giant's Daughter, that story. Great story. Then we have a Boris Vallejo cover for Conan the Freebooter. That's the third book. Another Boris cover for Conan the Wanderer. Conan the Wanderer is the fourth book. And then we get another Frazetta cover for Conan the Adventurer. Conan the Adventurer. That's an excellent cover. That's just awesome. So we have that one. Now this is an old-timey Lancer paperback. So this has a different cover. This is Conan the Liberator. And I forget who does this cover. And I don't have my glasses on foolishly. So even if they have who did the cover, I probably can't read it. But let me see. Does it have who did the cover in here? I don't see it. Somebody probably knows. Whoever knows who created this original Lancer cover for Conan the Freebooter, let us know, because I do not remember. Then we're going to go to Conan the Buccaneer. That has a great Frazetta cover right there. Conan the Buccaneer. And then Conan the Warrior. Conan chopping up all those dudes. Don't mess with Conan the Warrior. So, little tattered my copy of Conan the Warrior, but I believe this is my only copy of this book. So, I guess I'll be reading this one, Conan the Warrior. Then we've got Conan the Usurper. I've always liked this Frazetta cover. That's just such a cool cover, the way it's composed, with Conan facing the giant snake, which is from the Scarlet Citadel. So at this point, Conan is king in the series, because this is going chronologically. So Conan is the king of Aquilonia by this book. By the 8th book, he's already king. Then Conan the Conqueror. And what this is The Hour of the Dragon. It's Robert E. Howard's one full-length novel that he wrote about Conan. Most of his Conan stories are either short stories or novelettes, but this is his one Conan novel with Conan the Conqueror. Great cover. So this is The Hour of the Dragon, edited by DeCamp. L. Sprague DeCamp just changed some stuff here and there when it was absolutely not necessary, which you can say for all of his changes. So Conan the Conqueror. Then we have Conan the Avenger, another great cover. Love it. Conan the Avenger. And then Conan is becoming old, King Conan. In this one, Conan of Aquilonia. So all the Robert E. Howard stuff is done by this point. And there we have Conan's son, I believe, who Robert E. Howard did not invent. So this is Conan's senior citizenhood, depicted by Lynn Carter and L. Sprague DeCamp. Conan of Aquilonia. And then we have the final novel in the series. Again, on this one, I don't remember who the cover artist was, because this is the old Lancer edition of Conan of the Isles. I remember this one being the worst of the series. I remember this book not being very good at all. This is old Grandpa Conan as an old fella, still fighting monsters, still doing his, sword and sorcery thing. Again, this is entirely by... Is this all L. Sprague DeCamp, or does Carter help with this too? Yeah, this is L. Sprague DeCamp and Lynn Carter are doing this one. So that's the entire original series. Then, after that, there was another set of Conan pastiche books that go back into his career. Also a couple by Lynn Carter and L. Sprague DeCamp. And that's when we got Carl Edward Wagner's book, which I think was The Road of Kings. We had Poul Anderson do a Conan novel, and we had a few others. And this was all before the series went to Tor. And then Tor Books got a hold of the series and just did this huge run of Conan novels. The thing I didn't like about that was at the time when Tor was doing it, which I think must have been the mid to late 80s and through the 90s, Tor was doing its Conan set of books. They never really mentioned Robert E. Howard at all in those books, or at least very little. You picked up the book, it didn't say Robert E. Howard's Conan or anything like that. They were just pastiche novels about Conan. And at the time, I don't believe, into the 90s, I don't believe this set of books was still being printed. I think it was out of print by the 90s, these were out of print. So you didn't have original stories from Robert E. Howard available at all in new editions, from what I remember. There might have been a Fantasy Masterworks, actually, that came out right around that time, but that wasn't readily available to a lot of us American readers. So yeah, the 90s were a dark time for Conan, for those of us who liked the original Conan stories. Unlike now, when you can pretty much get everything. And It is a glorious time, at least to read Conan stories. Not for much else, but to read the original Robert E. Howard stuff. This is still available. So yeah, Cimmerian September coming. Well, it's coming in September. That would be the best time to have it, frankly, in September. So that's kind of what's going on. I know it's in the far future, but you know, those of us who are on BookTube, we got to plan ahead. Got to plan ahead. Okay, guys, I'll shut up now. I will catch you next time.